Hi, welcome. Today we will be learning about cognition, learning, and motivation by me, Melody Blystone, Learning Framework, December 5th, 2019. Learning is any permanent change in behavior that results from acquiring new skills or having new experiences. These experiences can be either physical or mental, but generally it results in a change in behavior for better or worse. There are many different methods and theories for how we learn, such as trial and error, practicing, conditioning, and insight, just to name a few. For example, when you were younger and your parents bought you that shiny new bike that you had been wishing for months, you grabbed a hold of those shiny handlebars, sat your butt on the seat, and put your foot on the pedal for the first time. Did you soar off into the sunset? Or, like all of us, did you fall down after one quick rotation of the pedal, realizing that your dreams of being an instant success are immediately dashed? Probably the latter, right? Just like the rest of us, though, you picked yourself back up, got instructions from your parents, and through many, many falls, you eventually learned not to lean too much this way or that, how to keep your head up, to watch where you're going, and how to keep your feet moving so that your speed is maintained. The experience of falling and continuing to edit each try until it became right, and you were able to soar off into the sunset, is an example of trial and error and how your brain processed the information needed to learn a new skill. Cognition. Oxford's dictionary defines cognition as the mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and the senses. To put it simply, it is the mental process that your brain goes through each day to absorb, process, and then apply the information it takes in. It is composed of both conscious and unconscious processes that use senses, thoughts, and experiences to help you retain information, form memories, problem solve, and make decisions. The learning process is made up of four main cognitive processes. Attention, which would be where you take notice of something and start to focus your attention on the material. Encoding, this is where your brain starts to organize and store the information. Storage, at this point, your brain has retained the information for future use. And retrieval, when you need to remember something learned at a later date. So, for example, let's say that I want to learn to do my makeup. Barring the idea that I have a handy-dandy makeup artist on hand to teach me the ropes, I would have to start somewhere. Maybe I look up videos online while taking notes about products used and techniques for application. Attention. Then I try these techniques on myself, encoding. I see what I like, don't like, and how I can improve, storage. My brain then stores this information so that the next time I do my makeup, I simply have to remember the information I previously learned. Retrieval. Motivation. Motivation can be defined as a process in which goal-oriented activities are started and maintained. What motivates us, though? What is the driving force behind our motivations? Here we will explore four theories of motivation: expectancy value, social cognitive, goal orientation, and self-determination. Expectancy value is dependent on two main factors: whether someone thinks they will be successful and the personal importance this task is to them. Say you have a test on Monday. You have studied so hard you feel confident that you will pass. This is the expectancy part of this theory. The other half started even before you began studying. You had to decide how important this test was and what was your interest level in the subject. You placed a value on this test that helped you to be motivated to study. Social cognitive. It's rooted in self-efficacy, but is influenced by personal, behavioral, and environmental factors. In other words, humans are self-regulating in their motivations and not just lab rats that learn from the shock of the cheese. Let's take this as an example. You took a really tough class this semester. The teacher expects perfection and the other students are competitive. This interaction from your environment will not only change your behavior, but in turn will change personal factors about you, thoughts and feelings, causing you to work harder in the environment to gain success and therefore creating a cycle of self-driven motivation. Goal orientation is different than the simple idea of, I want to learn to play the piano, so I will take steps A, B, and C to get there. The idea behind this goal is that people have a subconscious mindset that is either stable or entity performance goal driven or incremental mastery goal driven. To simplify, people with a performance mindset believe that you are born with certain traits or talents and you are either good at something or you are not. It causes them to go for less challenging tasks as their primary motivator is success. Mastery goal mindsets, however, believe that with practice you can learn anything. This leads them to try more challenging things and generally leads to more success as they are more willing to fail and get back up. Finally, this leads us to self-determination, which basically states that people pursue things they find enjoyable and will excel at those tasks because it keeps our attention. However, there are two main pieces to this theory when we reach a more mature age: intrinsic and extrinsic motivators. Intrinsic motivators are things we enjoy or things that motivate us on a personal level, like taking an art class to learn to paint because you've always enjoyed it. Extrinsic motivators, however, come from our environment. For example, if you don't show up for work that day, you will get fired and won't be able to pay your bills. This outside influence from your environment is what motivates you to get up and go to work. So, how do these three things relate to one another? Well, when we look at learning from a broader perspective, we see that in order to learn, we must first have a reason. Yes, number one. This is where motivation plays its part. If we don't have a reason, like goals, intrinsic or extrinsic motivation, or the expected outcome satisfaction, then the learning process would never begin. Now that we have our motivation to learn, we have to ask ourselves, how do we learn? Learning is a process that doesn't just happen. We have to evaluate, compare, form memories, and all of these things make up cognition. We are then left with what we have learned or the success of a job well done, which brings us back to motivation because when we successfully learn something, it helps to keep us motivated to continue to learn. How do we learn? Brains. We all have them, and we all hope they work in the same efficient manner as everyone else. What happens, though, when your brain doesn't work the way it should? How does this affect how you learn and process information? What would this do to your motivation for learning? Let's first look at how things we learn are processed in our brain and stored as memories. So, how do we learn? Short answer would be we collect experiences in our brains from memories, and our brains form memories so that later we can retrieve the information needed. What's the process, though, you ask? Basically, your brain is made up of neurons. These neurons form pathways and are able to talk to each other, so to speak, through a thing called synapses, which is a place where a chemical reaction happens that helps one neuron transmit a message to another. When we experience something, a signal is carried between neurons in a pattern. So like 2 quick bursts and a slow burst would make up your experience for eating pizza the first time. These are called sensory memories. They generally do not last very long unless you repeat the experience more than once. Then your neurons are able to slowly move closer together, which strengthens the signal and is then stored in your brain, first in your short-term memory and then in the long-term memory where it can be retrieved later. Okay, so now that we know the basic process of how memories are formed, let's go a little deeper and look at the brains of 3 specific types of disorders and how they might affect someone's learning, cognition, and motivation, since you know that is the point of this video. Dyslexia, traumatic injury, ADD, and ADHD brains. Uh-oh. Okay. Dyslexia, traumatic injury, ADD/ADHD brains. Dyslexia literally means a difficulty with words, most commonly word reversals or words and letters seeming to dance around the page. Children with dyslexia will show 2 main difficulties when asked to read at their grade level. They are generally not able to identify sight words as well as other students, and secondly, they will have a hard time decoding unknown words and will produce a lot of errors when sounding out and using context clues. What are the biological differences in a person's brain with dyslexia and one without, though? Well, our brain is primarily made up of 2 materials: gray matter, which is mainly responsible for processing information, and white matter, which is responsible for the transfer of information around the brain. Booth and Berman found that people with dyslexia had less white and gray matter than those without, meaning they aren't able to process or transfer information as well as those without dyslexia. This would definitely affect cognition and learning because without that ability, they will have a harder time retaining and understanding the information, and by association, motivation, because if things are harder for them, they will have less motivation to continue. Traumatic brain injuries occur when someone causes damage to the brain. This can range from suddenly hitting your head really hard to something more serious like an object piercing the skull and injuring the brain tissue. The extent of the injury can be mild, moderate, or severe depending on how severe the injury was, and can range from mild headache and loss of consciousness briefly to a coma and vegetative state. There are several ways that you injure your brain immediately, all of which can cause any of these factors that affect how the brain functions. Bruises, bleeding, lack of oxygen, bone or other objects piercing brain matter all can have varying degrees of severity, but they all have one thing in common: brain tissue is damaged. Now, how does a brain injury affect your learning? Well, that depends on what was damaged. When you injure your brain, neurons can be damaged, tissue can die, synapses will be interrupted or shifted, leading to issues in signal communication, and what your prognosis is depends on how badly it was injured. Even a small injury, though, can result in impairment of memory, information transfer issues, and issues recalling information, all of which is necessary in learning and will make it more difficult. ADD, ADHD, attention deficit disorder, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a disorder in the brain that affects a neurotransmitter called norepinephrine, which is also linked closely to dopamine. This disruption often shows symptoms of hyperactivity, impulsivity, and inattentiveness. 4 main regions in a person's brain with ADHD are affected as follows. The frontal cortex, which is responsible for someone's attention, organization, decision making. The limbic system, which helps to control our emotions and attention. The basal ganglia, which helps in brain communication and information, and without it working properly can result in attention issues as well. And finally, the reticular activating system, which is the main input and output pathway of the brain, which an issue here can cause attention problems, impulsivity, and hyperactivity. Clearly, when it comes to learning and cognition, these parts of the brain are imperative for a successful outcome. And finally, I want to give you just a short, brief history of public schools. Schools have a long history in this country. Oh my goodness. In 1647, for instance, they started out for religious reasons, the aim being that every Puritan child was able to read the Bible. Since then, they went through many changes over the centuries. Between 1779 and 1805, the main priority of public schools was all about teaching the poor the skills needed to work and creating an obedient, moldable workforce. Very few poor children were given access to higher learning. In 1790, Pennsylvania called for free public schools, but only for poor children. The wealthy were still expected to pay not only for their children to attend, but also taxes to help support the public school system. Then, in 1827, Massachusetts passed a law making all public schools accessible to all students, not just the poor. During these times, slaves were still not allowed access to schools under strict penalties, and Native Americans were being forced off their land in order to make room for schools to be built. In the 1840s, Irish immigrants completely invade the U.S. and are calling for more local control of those school systems in order to control the religious aspects being taught to their children. Between 1864 and 1877, 2 things primarily happened. Native American children were being forced from their tribes and put in public schools where they were no longer allowed to speak their native languages anymore. And secondly, with the end of slavery and the Civil War, African Americans are finally able to push politically to make constitutional changes that would allow public education not just for white children. In 1896, laws are passed that will allow African American children to attend school, but they must be segregated from the white population. This comes close on the heels of segregation being declared legal in the United States. In 1954, in the court ruling Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, it is finally ruled that segregation is inherently unequal and should be abolished, thus ending an almost 60-year process of segregation in the school systems. In the 1980s, a law was finally passed called the Tribal Colleges Act that would mean that Native American students can attend school without leaving their families. As we can see throughout history, wars have been won and hard fought to allow for equal education for all. The most persecuted among the groups now and then are still African Americans, Native Americans, and immigrants. They have struggled for hundreds of years for equal rights, and while we have made great strides forward, there is still much to be done. All right, that was it. Thank you so much for listening to me today, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.